The Reddit story, The Human Who Emerged from a Dungeon, is a popular tale within the HFY community, a genre that often celebrates humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and determination, particularly in scenarios involving other species, cosmic challenges, or fantastical elements. The basic premise of this type of story revolves around a human being found in a situation that would normally be impossible or overwhelming for others, such as a deadly dungeon filled with monsters or other deadly entities. However, the human not only survives but thrives, demonstrating traits like endurance, adaptability, and combat prowess, often shocking other species or characters who expect humans to be weaker or incapable. In this story, the human might have emerged from a dungeon after a long period, perhaps having been trapped or adventuring within it. This emergence can serve as a focal point for exploring themes like survival against overwhelming odds. The human may have endured extreme conditions, lack of food, dangerous creatures, or isolation. Power gained through hardship. The character might have learned new skills, gained mystical powers, or achieved mastery of their environment during their time in the dungeon. Cultural shock. There might be a juxtaposition between how others, non-human or local adventurers, perceive the dungeon and the human who has emerged. Often in HFY stories, humans exhibit qualities like mental toughness or a refusal to give up that astonish other beings. Human resilience and creativity. The story could highlight how human innovation or sheer willpower enables the protagonist to overcome challenges others would deem impossible. The HFY genre frequently elevates humanity's unique abilities, quirks, or emotions to showcase them as either superior or surprisingly effective. In a multiverse full of alien or magical creatures, in this case, the dungeon setting allows for an adventurous, gritty narrative that can blend action, exploration, and interpersonal dynamics, especially between the human and the beings they encounter after emerging. If you'd like, I can help create an expanded version of such a story. The light stung his eyes as he stepped from the yawning wall of the dungeon. It had been years now. Decades. Time had blurred together in the depths of that wretched place. He didn't know how long it had been since he'd seen the sky, but he knew one thing: he was not the same person who had entered. His ragged clothes hung loosely on a frame that was now lean, hardened. His once soft skin was now scarred and weathered from battles with creatures unimaginable. Muscles corded like steel cables rippled beneath his flesh as he took each step, and his eyes, they had changed most of all. They glowed faintly, a byproduct of some ancient artifact he had bonded within the deep. Whatever magic suffused the air inside the dungeon had left its mark on him, in ways no one would understand. The village that lay beyond the dungeon's entrance had changed as well. It was larger, more fortified. He remembered a small outpost, but now, tall walls surrounded it, and sentries patrolled the perimeter. People stared as he approached, whispering to one another. "Is that? It can be. The dungeon claims all who enter. He's been gone for so long. No one survives that long in there." A guard approached, his hand resting nervously on the hilt of his sword. "Identify yourself, stranger. No one approaches from the dungeon. Not alive, at least." The human stopped, looking at the young man, recognizing the look in his eyes. Fear. "I'm Callan. I entered that place a long time ago, seeking fortune and knowledge. I guess I found something else." The guard's eyes widened. "Callan, but no one ever returned. It's been nearly 20 years. We thought you were dead." "Not dead," Callan replied, his voice low and steady, with an edge that had been honed by years of survival just elsewhere. By now, a crowd had gathered. Old faces, once he remembered as younger, now bore the marks of time. Children who hadn't been born when he first entered the dungeon now stood among the crowd, looking at him with wide, curious eyes. But there was something else. The attention. The people weren't just curious, they were cautious, afraid. "You came from the dungeon," a grizzled older man in the crowd said, stepping forward. His clothes marked him as one of the village's leaders. "People don't just walk out of there. That place changes people, corrupts them. How do we know you aren't one of them now?" Callan clenched his fists. He knew they had every right to be afraid. Dungeons were strange, dangerous places filled with monsters, traps, and magic that no one fully understood, and he knew he had changed. How much, he wasn't sure. He extended his hand, palm up. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint glow sparked in his palm, a small sphere of light, no larger than a candle flame. The crowd gasped and backed away. Callan quickly closed his hand, snuffing out the light. "I learned things in there," Callan said quietly, "things that will help us, but I haven't been corrupted. If I had been, you wouldn't be standing here talking to me." The elder narrowed his eyes. "Prove it." Before Callan could respond, a loud roar echoed in the distance, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The crowd gasped and turned toward the forest beyond the village walls. A column of smoke rose into the sky. Something was coming. Monsters, dungeon creatures, ones that had started leaking out of the dungeon in recent years, growing bolder and more aggressive. Callan could feel it, a familiar sensation. He had faced such creatures many times within the dungeon, but never outside it. The villagers panicked, scattering to their homes and grabbing what weapons they could. The elder and the guards rallied, shouting orders, trying to prepare. Callan stood still for a moment, watching the chaos unfold, then took a deep breath. He had survived the dungeon, battled horrors no one here could imagine. He was changed, yes, but this world needed that change. He stepped forward, drawing a crude blade from his side, a weapon forged in the fires of the dungeon itself. Its edge shimmered with an eerie light, humming with ancient energy. "Stay back," the elder warned, seeing the blade. "We'll handle this." But Callan shook his head. "You won't be able to, not without me." His eyes glowed brighter as he turned to face the direction of the roar. "Let me prove it." Without waiting for a response, Callan moved. His steps were swift, purposeful. As he advanced toward the rising smoke, the villagers watched as the human who had emerged from the dungeon, changed in ways they feared, went to face the darkness once more. In the HFY spirit, Callan embodies the endurance and adaptability of humanity. Having survived and grown stronger in the depths of the dungeon, he emerges not as a broken man, but as one with the tools and knowledge necessary to confront the dangers now threatening the world outside. The story could continue with him gradually earning the trust of the village, battling both external and internal threats, while navigating the tension between what he's become and the lingering humanity inside him. Let me know if you'd like to explore more of this or another direction. Callan's steps were eerily quiet for a man of his size. The years in the dungeon had trained him to move with precision, to listen for every sound, every shift in the air. As he approached the forest's edge, the distant roars grew louder, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. The trees swayed as if something large was barreling through them, something much bigger than any creature this village had seen in years. Behind him, the villagers were scrambling to form a makeshift defense. He heard the clatter of weapons and armor as the guards gathered near the gates. They were brave, yes, but they weren't ready, not for what was coming. The air smelled of sulfur and decay, a smell that Callan knew too well. The dungeon had a way of marking its inhabitants, both those who survived within and those who tried to escape. This scent meant one thing: a creature had followed him out. It must have sensed him leave, or maybe it had been waiting, biding its time, until the dungeon's power weakened enough for it to break through. The trees ahead shook violently as something large crashed through them, snapping branches like twigs. Callan stopped, his glowing eyes narrowing as the beast emerged. It was enormous, easily twice the height of a man, with scales as black as obsidian and jagged, twisted horns curling from its skull. Its eyes gleamed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was lined with razor-sharp teeth. It let out a low growl that vibrated the air around it, causing the nearby trees to tremble. "A Felguard," Callan muttered, recognizing the creature instantly. He had fought its kind before, deep within the dungeon's darkest levels. Felguards were brutal, mindless beasts that acted as guardians for powerful artifacts, but they weren't supposed to exist outside the dungeon, not unless something had gone terribly wrong. The creature sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring as it locked onto Callan's scent. It let out a deafening roar, shaking the very ground as it charged toward him with terrifying speed. Callan's grip tightened on his blade. his mind racing. He had no armor, no backup, only the crude weapon he had forged in the depths of the dungeon. But he didn't need more. He had been forged, too. With a swift, fluid motion, Callan dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's charge. It crashed into a tree, shattering it into splinters. Without wasting a moment, Callan leapt onto its back, driving his blade between the creature's scales. The Felguard roared in fury, thrashing wildly as it tried to shake him off. But Callan held on, his muscles straining as he twisted the blade deeper into its flesh. Black, viscous blood oozed from the wound, but the creature wasn't going down that easily. Callan had fought these things before. He knew their weak points, hair joints, their exposed underbelly. He also knew that this wasn't going to be a short fight. The Felguard reared back, slamming its body into a nearby boulder, trying to dislodge him. Callan grunted in pain as the impact jarred his bones, but he didn't let go. Instead, he swung himself around, sliding down the creature's side until he was underneath it. With a quick, practiced motion, he plunged his blade into the soft flesh of its belly. The Felguard howled in agony, its thrashing becoming more frantic. Callan rolled out of the way as it collapsed, its massive body crashing to the ground. It twitched for a moment, then lay still, its glowing yellow eyes dimming. Callan stood, breathing heavily, as he wiped the black blood from his blade. He didn't have time to rest. There could be more. Turning back toward the village, he saw the crowd had gathered at the gates, watching in stunned silence. The guards had their weapons drawn, but none had dared to approach. They had witnessed the fight, seen the creature fall at Callan's hands. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, the elder, who had been watching from the front of the crowd, stepped forward, his face a mixture of awe and fear. "What was that?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. That thing wasn't like anything we've seen before. It came from the dungeon, didn't it?" Callan nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "A Felguard, a guardian beast. It shouldn't have been able to leave the dungeon." He hesitated, glancing back at the dark entrance looming in the distance. "Something's changing. The dungeon is weakening, and its creatures are spelling out." The elder paled. "Weakening? The dungeon's barriers have always been strong. How can this be happening?" Callan sheathed his blade, his eyes darkening. "I don't know, but if that thing got out, there will be more, worse ones. I've seen what lurks deep inside. You're not ready for it." The elder looked around, the weight of the situation settling in. The guards shifted uneasily, and the villagers whispered among themselves. Panic was beginning to set in. They had lived near the dungeon for generations, believing its terrors were contained within its depths, but now that barrier was crumbling. "What do we do?" the elder asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "How do we stop this?" Callan met his gaze, his expression grim. "You don't, not alone. I've spent years inside that place, fighting its monsters, learning its secrets. I survived because I adapted, and if we want to survive what's coming, you have to do the same." The elder frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "I'll train your people," Callan said, his voice firm. "I'll teach them how to fight these creatures, how to survive like I did. But we need more than that. We need to understand why the dungeon is weakening and how to stop it." The elder hesitated, weighing Callan's words. He glanced at the dead Felguard, then back at Callan. Finally, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "We'll do as you say. But know this, if you bring more of those creatures upon us, we won't hesitate to put you down. You may have survived the dungeon, but that doesn't mean we trust you." Callan smiled faintly. "I wouldn't expect you to." With that, he turned away, his thoughts already racing. The dungeon had always been a mystery, a source of power and danger, but now, something was different, something was wrong, and if he didn't figure out what was happening, this village and possibly the world would be overrun by creatures far worse than the Felguard. In the days that followed, the village became a flurry of activity. Callan wasted no time. The moment he stepped back inside the village, he began working. The people were reluctant at first, keeping their distance from him. He could see the suspicion in their eyes, the fear that he was no longer fully human, that the dungeon had corrupted him. But the attack of the Felguard had shaken them. They knew they couldn't face what was coming alone. On the first day, Callan stood in the village square, watching the guards as they trained. They sparred with wooden swords, their movements stiff and slow. He could see the fear in their eyes as they swung at each other half-heartedly, afraid to strike with real force. "This isn't going to work," Callan said, stepping forward. The captain of the guard, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Garrett, turned to him with a frown. He was young, perhaps younger than Callan had been when he first entered the dungeon. "You think you can do better?" Garrett asked, his tone laced with challenge. Callan didn't answer. Instead, he took the wooden sword from Garrett's hand and twirled it expertly, testing its weight. "You're not willing to kill," Callan said. "When those things come, they won't hesitate. You hesitate, you die." Without warning, Callan struck. The wooden blade lashed out with lightning speed, and Garrett barely managed to block it in time. The force of the blow sent him stumbling backward. "Again," Callan said. Garrett narrowed his eyes, his pride stunned. He raised his sword and attacked, this time with more vigor. Callan parried the blows effortlessly, his movements fluid and precise. It was clear to everyone watching that this was no ordinary fight. The crowd that had gathered to watch murmured in awe. "You've been fighting men your whole life," Callan said, deflecting another strike. "That's your problem. The things that come from the dungeon aren't men. They're faster, stronger, and they don't fight fair." Garrett growled in frustration, swaying wildly, but Callan was already behind him, tapping the back of Garrett's knee with his blade. The captain collapsed to the ground, breathless. "You need to learn to move," Callan said, stepping back. "You fight like you're carrying armor you don't even wear." Garrett glared up at him, panting. Callan could see the anger in his eyes, but there was something else, too: respect. For the rest of the day, Callan drilled the guards relentlessly, showing them how to strike, how to move, how to anticipate attacks. He taught them to fight like they were up against something far stronger than they were, something that would show no mercy. He showed them techniques he had learned in the dungeon, things that had saved his life more times than he could count. Slowly, they began to improve. But it wasn't enough. That night, as Callan sat by the village's main gate, sharpening his blade, the elder approached. His face was lined with worry. "You've been working them hard," the elder said, sitting down beside him, "but I can see it. In your eyes you don't think it'll be enough, do you?" Callan glanced at him, then back at his blade. "No," he said quietly, "not against what's coming." The elder sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Then what do we do? You've seen these creatures. You fought them. We've trusted you to prepare us. But if you don't believe it'll be enough..." Callan was silent for a moment. He stared out into the darkness beyond the village, where the dungeon lay in the distance, a black void in the earth. "The dungeon is a living thing," he said finally. "It adapts, it evolves. The creatures inside it aren't just mindless monsters, they're part of something bigger. When I was inside, I felt it, something old, something powerful. And now that it's weakening, the things that were held back are starting to slip through." The elder's face paled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this village is just the beginning. If the dungeon keeps leaking, if the barriers keep breaking down, the entire world could be at risk. I've seen what lives in the deepest parts of that place. If those things get out..." He trailed off, his gaze hard. "We won't be able to stop them." The elder swallowed, fear creeping into his voice. "Then, what do we do? How do we stop it?" "There's only one way," Callan said, standing up and sheathing his blade. "We have to go back into the dungeon." The elder's eyes widened. "Back? But you just escaped. You said it was nearly impossible to survive in there." Callan nodded. "It is, but I'm not the same man I was when I went in. I know the dungeon now. I know its traps, its creatures, its magic. And if we're going to stop this, I need to go back in and find out what's causing the barrier to weaken." The elder stared at him for a long moment, weighing his words. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, but you won't go alone. I'll send some of our best men with you." "No," Callan interrupted, his voice firm. "If they go with me, they'll die. I've seen too many people lost in that place. It's better if I go alone." The elder hesitated, then sighed. "I understand. But Callan, if you go back in there, Are you sure you'll come out again? Callan's eyes flickered with that faint glow, the mark of the dungeon that still lingered in his blood. I survived it once, he said quietly. I'll survive it again. The next morning, Callan stood at the edge of the village, his pack slung over his shoulder, his blade strapped to his side. The villagers gathered to see him off, their faces a mix of fear and hope. They knew what he was about to face, but they also knew that without him, they had no chance. Garrick approached, his expression hard but respectful. You sure you don't want any backup? He asked. I've seen how you fight. We'd follow you in. Callan shook his head. The dungeon's not like the outside world. It twists things, breaks them. The more people we send in, the more chances we take. It's better this way. Garrick nodded, though he didn't look convinced. Good luck, then. Don't die in there. Callan smirked. I'll try not to. With that, he turned and began his descent toward the dungeon. The air grew colder as he approached, the ground beneath his feet turning dark and cracked. The entrance loomed before him like a gaping wound in the earth, swallowing all light that dared to come near.